everybody, welcome back to U.S. History. So we're doing another two sections today, the War in the Pacific and D-Day. So get your notes out, let's get started. So the War in the Pacific. Although the Nazis were the first priority following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. did not want to wait until after VE, or Victory in Europe Day, to move against Japan. Now, fighting the Japanese was a major challenge. Resupply would be difficult. There's thousands of miles from home. You had to quickly construct bases and airfields on conquered islands. Japan had an impressive empire, and the attack at Pearl Harbor had decimated the Pacific Naval Fleet. However, the attack missed the U.S. submarines and the fleet's aircraft carriers, which was very fortunate for us, and those would become instrumental to fighting the Japanese. Now, Japan would dominate the early part of the war and further extend their empire to the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore. So the U.S. used a strategy known as island hopping, where we would move methodically from island to island, engaging the Japanese. Conquered islands one at a time often suffered heavy casualties. Now, it was brutal fighting, hand-to-hand combat, and the Japanese were willing to fight to the last man and do whatever it took. 94% of Japan's 117,000 troops at Okinawa were killed. Kamikaze pilots were Japanese pilots that crashed their planes into U.S. ships, also increased during this strategy to try and take out as many people as possible. When it comes to it, there's a couple of key players on the Allied side we need to talk about. General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, and arguably the most brilliant Allied strategist of World War II. For every U.S. soldier killed in the Pacific, 10 Japanese soldiers were killed. Now, according to one journalist, MacArthur took more territory with less loss of life than any military commander since Darius the Great from ancient Persia. You also have Admiral Chester Nimitz, who we've talked about briefly before, who was the commander of the American naval forces in the Pacific, specifically. Now, the Philippines. Japan attacked the U.S.-occupied Philippines in 1941. MacArthur was forced to abandon the island, and the Japanese took it over. Now, thousands of U.S. troops couldn't escape, and in May of 1942, they were sent on the Bataan Death March, a week-long march without food or water. Prisoners were typically tortured or murdered for no reason on this path as well. Now, we did fight back. In September of 1942, Doolittle's raid did a bombing run deep into Japanese territory. There was no real strategic advantage in the targets, but it did lift American morale and shock the Japanese. They thought they had reduced the U.S. to a third world power. Now, a couple months earlier, in May of 1942, at the Battle of Coral Sea, the Allies prevented Japan from taking Australia, and that was the first time the Japanese had been stopped. In June of 1942, we also have the Battle of Midway. Codebreakers discovered Japan's next target, the Midway Islands, and Japanese planes attacked the islands, but U.S. Navy forces ambushed the defenseless aircraft carriers. Japan's navy was cut in half. This was a turning point in the Pacific. The U.S. could now go on the offensive, and they were pushing the Japanese back towards the Japanese mainland. Now, they could no longer control the sea of the Japanese, so they focused on securing the islands they already had. Again, we started using that strategy of island hopping, and at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we retook the Philippines. Kamikaze pilots were used for the first time against us, and despite this, Japanese Navy was destroyed. In February and March of 1945, at the Battle of Iwo Jima, it was a strategic island close to mainland Japan. 70,000 Marines invaded versus 21,000 Japanese. It was a month-long battle, but we did win. 6,800 U.S. forces were killed in action, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The Japanese, on the other hand, out of the 21,000 troops, only 200 survived. And finally, in April and June of 1945, at the Battle of Okinawa, the kamikaze pilots sunk 30 ships and killed 5,000 sailors. The U.S. lost 7,600 men total. The Japanese lost a staggering 110,000 men, 94% of their forces there. So, chilling preview of what an invasion of the Japanese homeland would be like. An estimated 1 million U.S. lives would be lost if it came down to an all-out invasion of Japan. So that's it for the Pacific. So let's jump back over to Europe for D-Day. The U.S. had been planning a cross-channel invasion since their entrance into the war. They stockpiled supplies, equipment, medical supplies, and this was the success of mass production being realized. And hundreds of thousands of Allied troops had been stationed in Great Britain, along with the largest fleet of ships to date. So on June 6, 1944, under the cover of darkness, paratroopers were to be dropped in behind enemy lines to secure roads and strategic positions. At first light, the majority of Allied troops would arrive by sea and storm the beaches of Normandy. Hitler anticipated an invasion and had fortified the coast. And as a result, when Allied troops attempted to land at the five beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword, they did meet some resistance. But against all odds, the Allies actually succeeded, and the beaches were secured despite a significant loss of life to the Allies. All right, that is it for today. There's no new assignment. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.